Crafting your own role-playing adventure. Let's talk about the basic layout. First and foremost, what's the concept of the event that you're trying to create? Now, this video is for adventure-themed role-playing events, more for structured roleplay. This tends to be more featured around action and stuff like that. So, what's the concept? Is this a dungeon delve? Are you interacting with a storyline that's been ongoing? Things like that. Players typically coming to these events are going to be able to engage with the environment, roleplay, avoid traps or obstacles, and fight some enemies. So, a good question to ask yourself is, what kind of environment will this take place in? Is it going to be in the desert? Is it going to be a snowy climate? Is it going to be in a dungeon deep down into the depths with lots of dangers to delve into? Or maybe it's going to be a spaceship-to-spaceship battle if you're doing a sci-fi kind of story event. Another good thing to think about in line with this is, what can the players interact with? And ideally, your players are interacting with the environment in some kind of meaningful way, whether it's exploring and searching, opening up doors, looking through dressers and wardrobes and treasure chests, stuff like that, checking computer terminals and trying to hack into them. And another good thing I will say is that NPCs are wonderful for player engagement. A lot of times, a dungeon master that's kind of rather new to the stories will kind of give players a brief idea of something they need to do and then just drop them off and not really describe the environment or things they can interact with. And so it takes like 10 minutes for players to learn how to just walk around normally because they're kind of wondering what it is they're supposed to be doing. Well, NPCs are wonderful for players' engagement. Players love to interact with your NPCs, so it's good to have, early on an NPC or multiple people to talk to that you kind of point out, so players can go engage with them, or have them just come up and engage the players right away and kind of see how that works for you. Next thing you want to ask yourself in this basic layout is, what are the number of traps? And when I say that, I kind of mean traps and obstacles in general. On one hand, you have like pressure plates, you step on it and releases a switch, an arrow comes whizzing through, things like that. Maybe there's a camera, and the camera's swiveling around, and the players need to be very careful to sneak around in this blind side or use some kind of item or equipment that they may have to, temporarily blind the camera, right? In Metal Gear Solid, it was the chaff grenade. You throw the chaff grenade, and it sends those flecks into the air, which disrupt the electronic signals. Whatever creative thing you can think with that corresponds in the universe you're playing at. And then you have other obstacles, such as, for example, an obstacle course of sorts. Say they have to infiltrate a building. Well, your players may need to carefully sneak around from the outside of the building, search for an opening like a window or something, climb along ledges to get up there, maybe grab a hold of a ladder or put one up themselves, carefully opening the entryway and then lowering a rope so they and their allies can get down, things like that. Another big thing you want to consider in your basic layout is going to be your enemies' type and amount. So, good way to balance it, making sure that the challenge of the enemies is scaled to the number of players you currently have for that event. So if you have a massive number of players, maybe you want to think about massive combat where the enemies are more grouped together. Whereas if you have a very small number of players, you may want to keep the number of enemies they deal with kind of around their range. You want to think about things like action economy, which we can talk about later. But then alongside of that, you want to think about the type of enemy you have. So, are the enemies undead? Are the enemies droids? Are they mindless beasts that just are acting off pure primal rage? And that's going to affect what the players are able to do. And your players are naturally going to start thinking of strategies and tactics to engage with. So let's say that you have undead enemies. Your players may immediately know, okay, they're undead, they cannot bleed. Or you may have primal, just raw, maddened beasts, blood-crazed, ferocious monsters. Well, we know that those kind of enemies cannot be mind-controlled. Or maybe they're humanoids, which means they can be intimidated or threatened. So now let's get into the step-by-step. If you've gone through the basic layout, you already have kind of the general concepts of everything together. So now, how do we act it out? Well, as the Dungeon Master, you're going to be actively DMing for your players that are there at the event. You're going to be guiding them through the raid warning chat or the operations leader chat. Whatever game you're playing, you're guiding them and DMing them through the chat in the game. So you want to think about, first and foremost, how you're going to introduce the players to that scene. Once everyone's shown up and the event's starting, you're ready to go. Immediately drop them into the scenario with nice descriptive text. You all stand there in the deep dungeons of whatever we are, and you know that the goal is to get through the end of the dungeons and find the treasure that's said to be in the vaults. Well, this is where you have your 3-act structure. This is a very common thing in dungeon mastering, is splitting your stories into kind of 3 main segments. And it doesn't have to always be this place. It doesn't need to be perfectly balanced, and you often find that things turn out differently than you expect, but I tend to prefer the 3-act structure. The first is roleplay. Now, roleplay is simply the players engaging with each other, and I typically like to introduce this nice and early. So everyone arrives on the scene. This is their opportunity to look around, to explore, engage with the environment, any NPCs, talk to each other, things like that. They're acting in the place of their character. Now, as a dungeon master, what I would do very early on is I would give a brief overview of the area as soon as the event began. You see this, there's that. It smells like this. You can hear in the distance that. And then I would tell people to emote freely and then stack on me when you're ready to continue. And of course, now this is a little thing that I learned as a dungeon master. It's very helpful to have a stealth character in your MMORPG that you're playing as, so you can be an on-screen marker as a DM. So I would move my stealth character up a bit away from the group, and then so the players would emote and talk to each other. And when they were done emoting, or maybe they couldn't think of anything, that's fine. They would all move up towards my stealth character, who was acting as the marker in the world. So your roleplay, and naturally you want to go from there into step 2. And this is a good, juicy part of your event. This is your puzzle section. And your puzzle can take the shape of any kind of, thing, any kind of obstacle that's preventing them from moving forward. Something which requires them to think and to act and to make decisions. And you kind of encourage player autonomy in this, And so a puzzle would be something like a trap. Watching out for an explosive or something like that that's armed and ready to go. There's a door that's there and you need to find out how it opens. There's something in this room. There's all these different things in this room and we need to interact with it somehow in order to get the puzzle door open. It doesn't need to be a literal puzzle, but anything that requires them to interact and think about and explore the way through, you want them to use the resources they have available that they've earned in the guild, such as through skills and items and cool abilities, and their interactions with their other players to kind of engage with your puzzle and make it fun. Sometimes this can be more linear, and I recommend, for the sake of time and when it's early on, making something more linear versus something more open, because open is far more difficult to manage in the time that you're going through it. A good example of something that's more linear is more like you guiding them through obstacle course. There's this area and they see it and they perceive it and now they need to get through. And usually what I'll have people do is I'll kind of have them go through it at multiple parts. Like say that there's a camera they have to get through this hallway. Okay, everyone, give me a emote and then roll your dice to try to get through the camera. Let me know how you're doing it and then roll your dice. And then what I would do is if someone was being very creative and using an item or something like that, I would reward their emote that they're writing by giving them a bonus to their dice roll. And then, of course, I gave them, if you're familiar with 5e, a DC or a difficulty check. You're going to need to roll at least a 10 or higher to get through this obstacle. And so what they would do is they'd use their remote and then they roll their dice. So you want to make sure that they're using their emotes because that's where they start getting creative. And sometimes people would surprise me with such amazing emotes that I would just auto pass them. I would, think sometimes I would be like, that was so good and creative and I'd never thought of that. Consider yourself automatically past that obstacle and on to the next. And then you want to move people through in groups for the sake of time. You can do one at a time. That's going to take really long when you're talking about MMO roleplay. You can do it in duels as they get through the obstacle, or you can just move them all at once or in parties and groups. I typically group people together. And then you want to get to the third major aspect of your event, which is going to be combat. Now, a common pitfall for a lot of early DMs and DMers and MMO roleplay is to overfocus on combat. I've been to some events where as soon as you step foot in the environment, it's nothing but a constant battle and that's it. And some of those to me were the most exhausting to be in because combat can be fun. You want it to be fun. You want combat to consider things like the enemy types and the environment and the tools the players have at their disposal. What makes it unique about this encounter that, the players maybe have never experienced before? Combat can be fun, but you don't want to put them through a combat slog where that's literally all they are doing. It's very common starting out to kind of lean in that direction because combat gives you a sense of purpose. Everyone knows what they need to do in combat. They need to fight and kill the enemies. Very easy sense of purpose. But what makes it interesting is the different things going on in the environment, interacting with the environment, the enemies. Maybe you have things like weather affecting combat. You have things like multiple enemy types. Maybe the enemies are fighting in groups against groups of players. One enemy is engaging them directly, and another group of enemies is just charging in and flanking them from the side, catching them unaware. Combat can be a lot of fun, and that's where people get to stretch their characters out, especially in structured and adventure roleplay. They have worked on these characters over a long period of time, improved their dice roll number, and gotten more modifiers, gotten cool skills, proficiencies, gears, gadgets, and tools, and now it's time for them to stretch it out and use them. So, you have your combat, and I'll talk specifically about handling combat in future videos. But usually your combat is kind of the capstone of the event that kind of closes it off. It doesn't need to be super long, but combat is a great opportunity for players to get to stretch out their character. So keep an eye on time when you're managing combat in an event, because in MMO roleplay, combat takes a long time. So think about ways to make it go through as quick as possible, because your players are going to be there for a long time, and like I said, if your event is just nothing but a non-stop combat slog, that can be very exhausting. So let's talk about the end of the event. As I mentioned in a previous video, mini short events are 1 hour, mini story events typically are 2 hours, and that's a good time, especially if you're new, because honestly, it's a lot harder to write a 1 hour adventure than it is a 2 hour adventure. You always want to make sure you stop at a good time. It is far better to stop earlier than it is to stop late. If you have an adventure scheduled with your community of role players, you want to make sure that if you say the event's going to last for 1 hour, it ends at 1 hour. If the event's going to last for 2 hours that you scheduled it, it needs to end at 2 hours. You don't want to go beyond the 2 hour mark. You want to end it at the 2 hours or early, and it's better to default on the side of early than late. Because what's going to happen is a lot of times players may be okay in the moment of having you extend your event out for another hour. Oh yeah, we're having a great time. Keep going. But with the heavily scheduled roleplay events that are in MMO roleplay, you want to, 1, respect other hosts' time, 2, respect the time of your players, and 3, keep in mind that while players may be okay with it in the moment, they are going to remember it in the future when it comes to your events, and that may discourage them from coming back, because internally they have in their mind, each time I go to that event, it's scheduled for an hour, but it always turns into an hour and a half or 2. I don't have time for that event. So just keep that in mind. So at the end of the event, what do the players get? And this is something very important as a host. In a structured or hardcore role-playing guild, you typically have some kind of experience system. Once you gain enough experience and you level up in the guild, that's part of your promotion. So you want to make sure the experience is handed out then. And that way you're rewarding them participating in the community, You want to think about loot that you're giving out. And you want to be careful when it comes to loot, and I'll talk about that later as well, because loot is something that can easily make or break a game if you're not used to balancing mechanics. So it feeds into the whole ecosystem of the guild's core mechanical structure, so you want to be very careful when it comes to loot. Focus less on giving very powerful rewards as loot, and focusing more on color and flavor and empowering different skill and proficiencies rather than just raw attack and defense bonuses. So that's the end of this video. Plenty more to come as far as dealing with combat and mechanics. Let me know down below in the comments if you have any advice of your own that you've learned for creating your own events. There's a playlist over there. If you'll go ahead and subscribe, you want to see more videos like this. I'm going to be making a good bit more, dealing more of the dungeon mastering side of things when it comes to MMO roleplay. And thanks for watching. Bye.